Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Larry Socha. I am the Public Affairs Officer here at the U.S. Embassy in Bridgetown, Barbados. Happy New Year to many of you. Thanks for joining us for this lunchtime lecture. I often wonder how long you can say Happy New Year for, but I hope here still at the first half of January, it's an appropriate greeting. But I hope everyone's year is off to a good start. I know there are challenges, obviously, here at my home currently of Barbados, in Grenada, throughout the region and in the United States as well with regard to coronavirus. And I hope everybody is keeping safe, their families safe, their friends safe, and taking the necessary precautions. We're here today to talk about a very important subject. It is National Human Trafficking Awareness Day. And as part of our first lunchtime lecture here in 2021, we've brought together two experts to discuss this important issue. And I really look forward to the next hour to share information and to do what the day is all about, to raise awareness about this important issue. And so to start, I would like to introduce Dr. Joan Phillips. Dr. Joan Phillips is a senior lecturer and coordinator of sociology in the Faculty of Social Sciences. She is a graduate of the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill, and completed her PhD at the University of Bedfordshire. She's also a recipient of the Leverhulme Postdoctoral Fellowship from the University of London, Royal Holloway. Dr. Phillips has written extensively on sex tourism, return migration, and the relationship between sex, sexuality, and post-colonialism. Very much look forward to hearing from Dr. Phillips this afternoon. I would also like to introduce then our second panelist for today, and that's Brendon, who holds a Bachelor of Laws degree from the University of East London in the United Kingdom, and also a postgraduate diploma in professional legal skills from the City Law School, also in the United Kingdom. He is a qualified barrister at law, having been admitted to the Bar of England and Wales in 2013, and also to the Grenada Bar in 2014. He commenced practice as a prosecutor in the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions in Grenada in May 2014, and he currently serves in that position. But I wanted to mention today, many of you would likely seen the statement by our ambassador Tagliatella, in many of the newspapers across the region, where she addresses trafficking in persons or human trafficking as the scourge of modern day slavery. Mm-hmm. And what we wanted to do today was to talk about what does that mean in an Eastern Caribbean context? Because I think oftentimes we think, well, human trafficking, and we have an idea of what maybe Hollywood tells us that looks like, or maybe what personal experiences, unfortunately, tells us what that looks like. But we wanted to talk to Dr. Phillips and Mr. Touche today about what it looks like from their positions as someone in Dr. Phillips's case who studies this extensively, and then in Mr. Touche or Barrister Touche's perspective as a prosecutor from a legal perspective as well. So on that note, I'd like to lastly say that we thank both of them for participating today. It is conversations like these that are incredibly important. The United States wants to promote awareness on this topic, promote discussion on this topic, and most importantly, help countries like Barbados, like Grenada, and other countries in the Eastern Caribbean implement national action plans to address this scourge of modern-day slavery, human trafficking. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Phillips, for some initial words. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. As we say, today's National Human Awareness Trafficking Day, January 11th. And I want to bring global attention to the fact that human trafficking is a worldwide crisis affecting both the poor and vulnerable. And the situation has become more dire with the COVID pandemic. I think people are making desperate choices because of lack of job opportunities, making desperate decisions in order to feed their families. And we have to look at sexual trafficking in that context. And to provide some more context about what trafficking is before we go any further, I want you to understand that trafficking is big business, exceeding $150 million annually, and exceeding those from Apple and Google and so on. We're talking about big business. So when we think about that, think of that in the context of the Caribbean. Trafficking has a number of dimensions. I'm just going to go through this quickly because I know Brendon will talk about it. It's about their sexual exploitation, coercion, forced labor, forced begging, selling children, and the removal of organs. And we know it affects more women and children. Women and children make up about 49% of the trafficking. In terms of the research, and there are 49% of the victims. And sex exploitation, which is obviously follows, is the most common form of trafficking, followed by forced labor. And on this day, we reflect and pause, and I say that there have been some successes in terms of trying to combat this dire situation, this dire struggle. But there is a lot of this part of the industry that we do not know about, and it's very difficult to define because it is in itself is a hidden industry. We don't know much about the nature of extent of the problem, how many people are trafficked, where they're trafficked, and how best to combat this issue. What we know in the Caribbean, that the Caribbean has been identified as a source, transit, and destination region for human trafficking. And this international media has sometimes focused on the fact that they, for example, Interpol has claimed that they have identified 350 suspected victims of trafficking in April 2018 from Latin America and the Caribbean, including Brazil, Jamaica, Trinidad, Tobago, and Venezuela. However, the report does allege that these victims may have been subject to sexual exploitation and forced labor, and some were rescued from nightclubs, factories, mines, farms, and markets. But I also want you to think about what Tim Morris, the executive director of the police services, what was his statement. But after hearing all of this, he said, but what sits behind these numbers is the human story. And I, as a researcher doing work around this area, I want to focus on the humans. I focus on the human story. What exactly does trafficking? Does trafficking mean in the context of the Caribbean? Who is trafficked? Who is not? Who feels they're trafficked? And so on. We know there's anecdotal evidence. I say anecdotal because there's not been a systematic survey of identifying people who've been trafficked. But we know from anecdotal evidence that illegal migrants from Jamaica, Guyana, Haiti, and Dominican Republic are more vulnerable to being trafficked across the Caribbean. And we know as a fact that these people are more vulnerably economically than some other countries of the Caribbean. And from my research experience and others who've written in the area, we know sex trafficking has been conflated with the whole idea of migrant sex work. So it's very difficult to extrapolate sex trafficking from migrant sex work. And what we find, the assumption of the Caribbean government is to say they're legal, criminalize the victims, arrest them, and deport them. That has been the government's response so far to the trafficking issue. The system of deportation as the way to resolve the trafficking issue is not, I say again, a victim-centered approach to combating sex trafficking. This approach denies the voices of the victims to be heard, and consequently their ability to inform any policy that can be developed. We know little about their stories, their working conditions, and their outcomes. And that is why we need further research in the area, further underground research, interviewing these women, men, and so on who have been trafficked. I did some research. I did some research looking at trafficking in the Barbados. It was very anecdotal, not very systematic, but who I interviewed had a very different experience of what being trafficked or having been moved from one area to the other than what is purported in the UN and the international media. For example, I spoke to a woman called Sherry. I'll call her Sherry. She's a 30-year-old Guyanese woman who was already dancing in a club in Guyana. But when she was approached by the owner of a club from Barbados, she was encouraged to Barbados, and she felt that working in Barbados provided her more money to provide for her 5 children and her mother who looks after them. So the club owner made all the arrangement for Cherry, loaning her some money for airfare and accommodation. And the last time I spoke to Cherry, she had decided to stay in Barbados, although her visa had expired. So in terms of asking people about trafficking, for Cherry, she didn't think she was trafficked. I mean, she felt that she made a difficult decision in order to look after her children. And she felt trafficking was something that they heard about, but they knew it didn't fit their particular circumstance. And even though with her friends, some of their passports were held by the owners of the club, and we can see that we define that as trafficking. They didn't see it as such a big deal. They felt that key informants, those whose passports were held, was for a particular reason, meaning that they had a tendency to run away before completing their time there. So for Cherry and other women, they felt this was just part of the business arrangement. So looking at the context of the Eastern Caribbean, I think we have a lot of more work to look at in terms of the research and trafficking, because what trafficking in the Caribbean, based on looking at the research, does not look or align itself with what we see and hear in the media. There's no white van throwing women in a truck and driving off, and they're never seeing their family for 5 or 10 years. That's not the case. The case here is people make the decision. Although some people will say, well, it was a forced decision. It is a forced decision because there are very limited options to make a living. And do we say that is sex trafficking? Or do we say sex trafficking is much more fluid and much more complex than the UN definition or the American definition? And we really have to look into the impact of culture on sex, on trafficking, because selling, I would say, the selling sex is very much part of the Caribbean history, and women moving and migrating to different parts of the country is part of this. It's also very difficult to ask somebody, have you been trafficked? Was this forced? If the person says, this is not forced, this is a decision that I have made, is it sex trafficking? Was that person trafficked? And I think Brendon will be able to answer all of that in terms of the legalities of it. Because, and I think this is the conundrum faced by Caribbean governments, which is to challenge a system that they're not quite sure how to approach. A system that's already linked to sex tourism and sex work. So when we do look at sex trafficking, we have to pause and reflect, as we do today, in the context of, and say, how do we define context in this particular situation? How do we find sex trafficking in this particular situation? One size does not fit all. And I think that is some of what the challenges some of the Caribbean governments have been facing in terms of trying to combat trafficking. If it doesn't look like trafficking, if it doesn't feel like trafficking, is it trafficking? So therefore, do we have trafficking in the Caribbean? What I think is more important to look at, and what sex trafficking has raised, is the fact that poverty is a major driving force for a lot of people in order to save their families. And sex trafficking, and those who look at sex trafficking have also to look at poverty. People do not make these decisions without having been forced to, unless this is a poverty-stricken situation that they cannot afford to feed their children or their families. And in terms of having a more victim-centered approach, again, we need to pause, reflect, and take a step back and examine what is a victim-centered approach to combating sex trafficking. Victim-centered means to be putting the victim and allowing the victim, giving voice to the victim, to their experiences. And then we can be able to actually build and formulate policies around what they're saying. The basic thing is, how do we combat this level of poverty that we're having in the Caribbean, that women and men and children are forced to migrate to another country in order to survive? And I thank you for your time. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Phillips. There's a lot to think about there, and I appreciate some of the personal stories that you shared. So Brendon, Dr. Phillips said that you would have all the answers. So what she did say, though, that it is not a one size fits all issue. And so if from the Grenadian perspective, you could talk a little bit about legislation in Grenada and how Grenada addresses this important challenge.
Yes, good afternoon again to everyone. Yes, I should preface what I am going to say with saying that in July of 2019, I had the privilege of going on a program in the United States on this very issue of human trafficking, where I had the opportunity to meet with other personnel, be it law enforcement, legal, NGOs, who operate in this field from other countries, and to hear their best practices, problems, issues, and and look at that in the context of the U.S. approach. So what we found was that the approach taken by the U.S. mirrors a lot the approach taken in the other countries. So a lot of what my research is based on the U.S. front, as well as other countries along the world which grapple with this same issue. Let me first start by saying that the fight against human trafficking requires a multi-dimensional or multidisciplinary approach. What I mean by that is this: it requires a collaborative input by various stakeholders. So prosecutors, law enforcement, police, victim support agencies, other NGOs, members of the public, and of course the victim themselves. Now, human trafficking cases are time-consuming and difficult, and that poses a challenge to prosecutors, investigators, and victim service providers alike. Successful criminal investigations and prosecutions flow from positive partnerships and collaboration among criminal investigators and prosecutors, and a myriad of service providers. The human traffickers work across various jurisdictions, and therefore task forces are needed to be positioned to deal with that issue. Navigating complex jurisdictional dynamics often involves a multitude of investigators and prosecutors at different levels. Law enforcement task force members need to be mindful that human trafficking investigations are purposely victim-centered, because it is the victim that supplies the most critical evidence. And that is common in all jurisdictions, the US, in the Caribbean, and other places around the world. It's the personal testimony of the victims themselves that is critical once the matter proceeds to trial. The difficulty that is faced with that from law enforcement perspective is that you are dealing with vulnerable persons. And of course, persons who are either mentally or physically unstable and don't feel comfortable sharing their experiences with law enforcement. And so that is one of the big challenges that law enforcement and prosecutors alike would face in the successful investigation and prosecution of persons involved in human trafficking. So, two things. The need for a specific task force has been raised, and that has been implemented in the US, in various states, and in the Caribbean, that to set up to deal with human trafficking and investigate human trafficking, and also training of the required personnel to deal with human trafficking. Now, Dr. Phillips did touch on the issue of identifying human trafficking and what it is, and that sometimes it may go unnoticed. A person might not realize that they are in fact being trafficked, which brings me to the other issue that is faced by law enforcement and prosecutors. That is because human trafficking can take various forms. That is, can be in the form of sexual assault, prostitution, kidnapping, forced labor, and so on. What you find in the region and other places is that law enforcement officers themselves are not familiar with human trafficking, the statute, its definition, how to identify it. And so a lot of the times it goes unnoticed by law enforcement because it is masked as these other crimes, which I mentioned. Some of the other issues that we notice from the law enforcement and the prosecutorial side is that there's limited resources of funding available sometimes to deal with combating human trafficking. The time that it takes to conduct detailed investigations, interviews, and to uncover the human trafficking. And also, lack of training for the law enforcement officers. Law enforcement's investigation of criminal activity may not always recognize a potential human trafficking case. And so the misidentifying the offense as either prostitution or domestic violence, or sometimes an issue of unpaid wages, usually go unnoticed. Some of the needs or capacity building areas which are identified were in victim identification and training from early detection of the crime, investigation, and subsequent prosecution to the delivery of services. As it relates to best practices and strategies of law enforcement, some of that include, as I said, starting a task force. And this involves usually one or two persons of a small representative group who are given dedicated services to identifying, training in human trafficking. So, and what happens usually is that someone is appointed, identified to be the point person in this task force. And that person would, when they would analyze and digest the information that they receive, let's say they get a tip on human trafficking, and they would decide how to disseminate that information to the various stakeholders so that you don't have the same various bodies chasing down the same lead. Because of course, time is a critical factor here in apprehending the perpetrators who commit human trafficking. Let me now go to looking at the prosecutorial side of it. In 2000, the US had implemented the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which basically promoted what they call the 3 Ps, which is prevention, protection, and prosecution. What it did was it created a new federal crime of trafficking and increased the penalties for existing offenses. So criminal penalties prohibiting and punishing sex trafficking, in which commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, in which a victim is under 18. And also labor trafficking, that is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. And the pivotal point here has to do with force, fraud, or coercion, because a lot of the times persons may be looking for someone who may have some physical identifiable marks, some bruises, or something which they may look for. But as we're realizing, trafficking can take different forms. It doesn't have to be something that is only physical. So if the person was subjected to force or fraud or coercion, that also is deemed to be an offense of trafficking. I want to address some, well, before I go to that, the case studies. Let me look at the Grenadian context. Now, in Grenada, we passed the Prevention of Trafficking in Persons Act in 2014, and this came into force on the 5th of February 2016. Since then, we have only had one case of migrant smuggling, which involved 10 Nepalese and a Ghanaian national in 2015. The Nepalese nationals were allegedly tricked into traveling to St. Lucia for studies and job opportunities. Once in St. Lucia, they discovered it was a fraud and engaged with smugglers to continue their travel to Grenada. The Ghanaian national traveled from Trinidad and Tobago to facilitate their arrival into Grenada. Officers of the Royal Grenada Police Force apprehended a group of Nepalese nationals within the territory of Grenada. The Ghanaian national was convicted for smuggling of migrants, fined and deported back to Trinidad and Tobago, where he had residence. The Nepalese were assisted in their return to St. Lucia. Of course, it's impossible to confirm, but it should not be excluded that it was a smuggling case that could have ended up as a human trafficking case if not identified by the Royal Grenada Police Force. Apart from that one case, there has not been any other case with possible links to human trafficking in Grenada. Further, there is little anecdotal evidence that suggests human trafficking would be present in Grenada, and if so, it is on a small scale. However, only a few individuals in Grenada have been trained to identify signs or red flags indicating possible human trafficking cases. So again, we're looking back again at the issues of identification of human trafficking. So it might well be that this crime is being unnoticed in Grenada and possibly other regions because of the lack of training in that field. There is no way to know until the institutional stakeholders have increased their capacity to identify this crime, and the public in general is made aware about this existence. Progress in establishing a structured counter-trafficking framework has been slow in Grenada and some of the other islands in the region. However, criminal networks are continuously diversifying and expanding their activities of human trafficking. So coupled with the geographic location and porous borders that many of us in the islands and the region face, it's a difficult one to police and one to investigate. But no doubt it's one which requires the attention of authorities on a grander scale. And again, I would, reiterate the need for task force in all of the islands to look into the issue of human trafficking. Just lastly, I want to touch on some 2 case stories coming out of the US from the state of Ohio. Just briefly, the first one is the state against Frederick Brown and Stacey Drake. This was in 2015. So Frederick Brown was a pimp, and Stacey Drake was what they call the bottom. And bottom refers to a recruiter. Sometimes in this case, you'd find victims themselves who end up working for the main trafficker or the pimp. And in this case, this is the role that Stacey Drake played. The brief facts for this was that Brown was enticed 2 15-year-old females to perform sex acts for hire. Brung knew the two juvenile victims from his neighborhood. One day he asked the two victims if they were interested in making some money. Both victims got in his car and he subsequently drove them to a hotel. There he and Drake took provocative pictures of the two girls and posted them on his site, which is backpage.com. Law enforcement officials noticed the ad on the site and suspected that the two victims were juveniles. Later that night, officers pulled Brung over at a traffic violation and recognized the two victims as minors on the site. Brung and Drake were subsequently arrested for trafficking in persons. The outcome, after a bench trial, Brung was found guilty of 2 counts of trafficking in persons and 2 counts of compelling prostitution. He was then sentenced to 13 years imprisonment. Drake entered a plea agreement and was sentenced to 120 days in jail, 5 years of community control, and received a $2,500 fine. The evidence that was relied on in this case was online advertisements, hotel receipts, hotel clerk testimony, cell phone extractions, co-defendant cooperation, victim testimony, and victim statement to law enforcement. And finally, the last case I want to make mention of, the state against Isaiah Harris, aka Red. And facts of this case are that this started out as an investigation into the defendant for dealing drugs out of a hotel room. After a search warrant was executed, detectives discovered he was also pimping several women. Targeted drug-addicted young women. He provided them with a place to stay and easy access to heroin and crack. He fronted the drugs and they were always in debt. The only way to pay the debt was through prostitution. The use of drugs and physical beatings was what he used to compel the women into submission and doing what he wanted to do. The outcome, after a jury trial commenced and several witnesses, including the victims, testified. During trial, it was discovered that the defendant was attempting to tamper with witnesses. The defendant pleaded to the indictment, including 3 counts of trafficking persons. He was sentenced to 20 years imprisonment. His co-defendant, Marissa Horner, pleaded to compelling prostitution and was sentenced to 3 years in imprisonment. So these are just 2. There are several, many other cases coming out from the US and the region. But let me just end by saying that it's the issues that are faced by law enforcement and prosecutors are really the identification of these human trafficking itself, and that's where it starts. Because if we're not able to identify it, then we're not able to really start anywhere and don't know where to look. We don't know who are the stakeholders that we should include. And so it calls for a collaborative effort, and it calls for more public awareness on what human trafficking is. And so that the public, victims in particular, know or aware that they are being trafficked. And so that, the various stakeholders can be informed and the necessary actions taken. Yeah, that's it from me. Thank you again for listening.
Thank you, Brendon.
Thank you for presenting, Brendon. And I like the kind of concise way you framed how we address this issue through the 3 Ps: prevention, protection, and prosecution. I also heard you mention in that first example in Ohio, backpage.com, and having worked in a number of different programs here at the embassy, we have a program called American Film Showcase that allows us to screen different documentaries. And there's actually a documentary from 2017. If any of our participants this afternoon have a chance to look it up, it's called I Am Jane Doe. It's a documentary about Backpage.com and about legal ways to address human trafficking in the United States. I mean, Backpage.com became one of the largest marketplaces for buying and selling of sex until it was seized by the U.S. government in 2016 or 17. But it's a great way. It's a great documentary that really tells the story of human trafficking. So thank you, Brendon, for sharing all of that. We are ready to take some questions for the next 20 minutes from the online audience here, and thanks to those who have already contributed. This first question that came in from Marcia Brandon, I'll send this over to you, Dr. Phillips, actually, because I know Brendon mentioned, the question here is, has the Caribbean implemented Trafficking Act, etc.? And Brendon mentioned in his presentation there, the legislation in Grenada formed in 2014, and then it came into force in 2016, and the important role that legislation has played. Dr. Phillips, could you give us an understanding of where we are with legislation in Barbados?
We already have the legislation. What's it, in 2014, I think? Correct me if I'm wrong. We've had legislation in 2014. We do have the task force. We've trained policemen and particular other stakeholders to work with women and men who've been trafficked. So because we're tier 2, it says we've met the minimum requirements in terms of trafficking. We've done all that we can. But the issue is the complexity of the issue. As Brendon was saying, it's not easy to find people who are trafficked. And it's not easy to go through the court system because particularly in Barbados, and I think this is just shortfall for Barbados, Barbados has no support systems for those going through the court system and who are not Barbadian. There's no money, there's no accommodation in terms of a halfway house, there's nothing. And that's what usually ends up is that person is deported.
No, it's interesting what you said earlier about the answer cannot be deportation because that is not a victim-centered approach. And then Brendon talked about how important the victim is to investigations and prosecutions. And so I think both those contributions really fit well together. Brendon, did you want to say something more on the role of the victim in kind of the legal prosecution?
Yes. So from the Grenada standpoint, our legislation does make provision for compensation to victims from the perpetrators. So they can be compensated once convicted. But there is, in the US, they have different agencies which are set up for victim support. And there is also, in fact, the legislation which I mentioned, from the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, creates different types of visas for victims who are subjected to human trafficking, which allows them to remain in the US based on certain criteria. So maybe they have to assist prosecutors with with their case and law enforcement. And there are different other visa which they can apply to, which allows them to stay or remain for an extended amount of time. Yeah.
Thank you for that. We'll go to a comment here by Jonathan Bagan. Human trafficking can also take place due to exploitation of locals by locals under international convention. Brendon, could you just legally talk to us for a second? Does trafficking involve going from one country to another, or can you be trafficked within Grenada by another Grenadian?
Right. So it normally, as it stands now, it involves from one country to another, not domestically. If that answers the question.
Right. In the Grenadian experience, and Dr. Phillips, you identified some of the source countries in your earlier comments: Haiti, Jamaica, Guyana. I think I heard you mention Brazil and Venezuela as well. Dominican Republic or Dominica?
Dominican Republic.
And how you also mentioned the poverty, and I'm wondering, we see what's going on in Venezuela, for example, and the mass exodus of persons from Venezuela for security reasons, for economic reasons, for political reasons. Has your research encountered an uptick in individuals who are either trafficked or involved in these networks coming from Venezuela, given the events of recent years?
I mean, Barbados is also, as I was saying, a source country, and they also a recruiting country, and their particular exotic looks that seem to work well here in Barbados. The exotic hair and the high coloring and so on, and these are more likely to be trafficked into Barbados for example, to parties or what have you, because of their so-called exoticism.
There's a good question here too on, where do we find information about this issue? The question comes from Jessica St. Rose. Are there any statistics from stakeholders in government on the various islands and human trafficking? Dr. Phillips, given your research, are there sources that you could point us to?
I would say they're more of guesstimates, because nobody is sure how many people are really trafficked. It's very difficult because firstly, the person has to be identified as trafficked and actually go through the whole process, and that's I guess that is something that we need to work on. We need to have a comprehensive quantitative and quantitative assessment of what's really going on in the region in terms of trafficking, because we do not know. So much is hidden, and the figures that are available are those who actually have been in contact with officials and so on.
No, thank you for that. It's navigating the narrative stories, and I think Brendon used the word trafficking persons can be masked by other crimes. So you might be focused on one thing, and really at the root issue here could be a trafficking issue. I appreciate Jason Haynes weighing in here. There can be international trafficking, but also domestic trafficking as well, and I think that's important to emphasize. And also the fact that, and I think both of our panelists today have discussed this, it's not just sex tourism. I mean, there are issues of forced labor as well, for example, that might not involve sex, that are part of the larger trafficking issue. So appreciate those contributions. There is a question here from Sarah Purcell about, and a question we'd like to address in these lunchtime lectures. So now what? Sitting here maybe, or one of our participants, they're not the ones who are going to be arresting an individual who's involved in trafficking another human being. They might not be a representative in government who could draft the action plan or the implementing legislation of the action plan. So how can individuals get involved? Are there volunteer opportunities? Are there organizations that individuals can go to learn more about the issue and help?
that's a sort of challenging one because it's one of the issues that is faced, especially in Grenada. And where do you go if you want information? Who do you go to? It goes back to the last question you just asked as to, and Dr. Phil didn't make mention of it. There isn't a central database, if I call it that, or place to get all the information you need. What you find, especially in Grenada, is that it's piecemeal. You get some information from police, you may get some information from the ministry, you'll get some information from the DPP's office, get some information from customs. So it's scattered all over the place. And that is a challenge. So I think first we need to have a central unit or database with, as I mentioned, personnel from each one of these stakeholders working in this one office, which I think would definitely help with that issue of where persons can go. So you have a one-stop shop then in dealing with human trafficking. Yeah.
Dr. Phillips, did you want to add anything?
I just want to reiterate what Brendon said in terms of the fact that it's so ad hoc. At the moment, we are very, I don't want to say diminished, but our work is so diminished by the fact that everything is ad hoc. For example, you wouldn't find somebody who's trafficked until, for example, the police raids a club and realize that half the girls who are working in the club are not Barbados, nor do they have any identification. So it is very ad hoc, and it is also very hidden. It's very difficult to try to find solutions to something that is very hidden and very invisible to most people. And I think that is the issue. I think what Brendon says about public awareness, public training, and people realizing, not because you're poor, that doesn't mean that you have to be exploited. There are different ways of, and if the government and other institutions can help, there are different ways of, of helping yourself and helping your family. And I think, and I think at this point, people just feel that there's no way out for them at this point.
Thank you, Dr. Phillips. I want to thank too Jason Haynes, who's shared some resources in the chat here, as well as Jonathan Bagan, who's contributed some interesting thoughts as well. So thank you both. Dr. Phillips, I want to go back to your comments about if it doesn't look like trafficking, if it doesn't fit the description of trafficking, is it still trafficking? And I think of, let's take for instance, young women who are forced, as you said, by issues of poverty into the trafficking network. Do they have an option to leave at any point? I mean, what has your research shown, or what have your conversations told you about what is the out for women who might have got involved and then realized, wow, I'm in real danger here?
I think the out for women is contacting maybe a police person, a policeman or somebody they know, but they also know they have to make sure they cover the cost of that the intermediary man or woman has paid for their hotel, their living arrangements and so on. So they have a sum of money that they have to make before they can leave. So, and that's the big issue. And I think that's the thing that keeps them in place for quite a while, for a long time. Until they have recovered that money, they cannot leave.
Brendon, in the example that you shared of the Nepalese and the Guyanese trafficker, there's a question here from St. Kitts and Nevis from Bucky Goddard Williams about deportation. I think you mentioned the Guyanese was resident in Trinidad and therefore departed there. Is that an expensive process, or what is the process for deportation?
Okay, so it's not that not an expensive process. Trinidad is pretty close to us, so it's not that of a difficult process. They're either removed via air or sea. So it's not a difficult process at all.
And Dr. Phillips, going back to your comments about individuals are then given kind of this target that they must meet to make a certain amount of money. When it comes to trafficking, what are the links with other organized crime or networks of trafficking in illicit substances, illegal drugs? What are the links? I mean, are they all tied together, or do you find these kind of one-off traffickers who have just kind of found their niche and have exploited that business to contribute to, as you mentioned, this $150 million illegal business that's going on?
Yeah, and with respect, I cannot comment on whether there are any linkages. I could say there might be linkages, but my focus is more on the women who've been trafficked and their experiences. And it's more about having enough money to send back home to help feed their children. Or they might be dancing in one club, but they'll be asked to dance in a very, very nice place. I don't want to say nice place on the coast, or something totally different. So their focus is the more money they get, the faster they can get that money to feed their children. And if they want to, they can stay and do it all over again.
Yeah.
Again, it's, as you were saying, it's about raising self-confidence and telling people this is not the way you can actually make your money. This is not the only way. And we need to have support networks. I know in America, there's this church, there are different organizations who actually help young women in terms of getting out of these situations. But in Barbados, and I can say for a lot of the Caribbean, we do not have those networks of support.
No, it's a difficult issue for sure. And I think Brendon's comments, not only limited to the legal remedies for this, but just in all, it's going to involve a lot of stakeholders. It's not just the trafficker and then the police. It involves entire communities to address this issue. We only have a couple minutes left, so I just want to give both of you a chance to offer some final words here. Again, incredibly thankful for your time today to discuss this issue, to raise awareness of the issue, what it looks like, and how we can prevent, protect, and prosecute these crimes. Brendon, I'll go to you first and leave the final word for Dr. Phillips.
Yes, thank you. But I just want to reiterate that this issue of human trafficking is real. It's a big problem that is affecting many countries, not just in the region, the US, but all over. And the highlight the difficulty with investigating it and also prosecuting it. So I would also reiterate the need for having more attention placed by the authorities or government to this issue, making it a public awareness social issue, and then we can take it from there by having a collaborative effort from all stakeholders work and address it. I think if we do that, then we can see some real results coming forth in cracking down on it, because it's going to always continue, because there's always going to be an avenue for it. It's a money-making business, like drugs and other organized crime, and because the social status of person in these countries are so divergent, There's always going to be a target group for the vulnerable person. So that it calls also for bringing on the social services of the various countries to address the issues and concerns of those persons who are targeted for human trafficking, and we can take it from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Brendon. Dr. Phillips?
I think we need to take a step back and find out, in terms of looking at the poverty situation, and because of the ongoing economic recession, more and more people are finding themselves out of work, illiterate, unemployed, and so on. And this is an easy way, not an easy, but more difficult way to, this is a way to help families. And unfortunately, people use this to exploit other people. The need to get out of poverty. I see somebody mention Jabez House, but yes, Jabez House, I think, I might be wrong, you can correct me, but focuses more on local sex workers rather than sex workers, not rather than Jamaicans and so on, non-Barbadian sex workers. And I think we'll need a multi-dimensional approach to it. Not only, as Brendon said, not only the police, we're looking at health workers, social workers, psychologists, even people who were a part of it, to give their input into the situation. This is not something that can be easily solved, because we can't solve inequality in society, and this is what it is. People are preying on people who cannot afford, and we can't solve inequality in society, but then we can try to have a more multi-pronged approach to it. We're not going to solve it, as I said, but we can help reduce it in the Caribbean.
Thank you, Dr. Phillips. On that note of we can't solve it immediately, but we can help reduce it, is, I think, a perfect place to wrap up our discussion today. So Crown Counsel, Prosecutor Brendon Touche, Dr. Joan Phillips, I want to thank you both for your thoughts, your contributions, and your work on behalf of the people of Grenada and Barbados to support victims of this horrible crime and to hold those who commit it responsible. So thank you again. Thanks to all of our participants today. U.S. Embassy Bridgetown has a statement on this. Check it out on our website at bb.usembassy.gov. And we'll actually be back next week for another virtual conversation, another lunchtime lecture on Martin Luther King Day, which is next Monday, entitled "The Business of Doing Good." So please stay up to speed with us on social media, and we look forward to being in touch. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.